Welcome to Financial Repression Authority's Roundtable Insight, where the best fund managers, economists, and industry leaders discuss the key investment issues and challenges in the current macroeconomic environment.
Hi, welcome to FRA's Roundtable Insight. This is Richard Bernoulli. Today we have Charles Hugh Smith. He's author, leading global finance blogger, and America's philosopher, we call him. He's the author of several books on our economy and society, including A Radically Beneficial World, Automation, Technology, and Creating Jobs for All, Resistance, Revolution, Liberation, A Model for Positive Change, The Nearly Free University and the Emerging Economy, Pathfinding Our Destiny, Preventing the Final Fall of Our Democratic Republic, and Will You Be Richer or Poorer? His blog of twominds.com is one of CNBC's top alternative finance sites. Welcome, Charles.
Well, thank you, Richard. And that entry always reminds me that many of your other guests are much higher on the financial food chain than I am.
No, you have one of the greatest perspectives we've ever talked with, and you frequently blog. We'll talk about one of those blog posts that you have today, and just thought today we'd do a focus discussion on some interesting developments in the economy and the financial markets and your recent observations on them, specifically indications in the banking sector that something is terminally broken in the financial system. So let's explore what you see happening, why is it happening, and what are the implications of it happening. So maybe we begin with the article that you'd like to focus on.
Right. And this was an article on Zero Hedge. And what was really striking about it, Richard, was all the charts, which showed the big commercial banks, their loans, outstanding loan book, and their deposits. And so this is for JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citicorp, Wells Fargo. These are, the four big major banks. Now, the idea here, I guess, and all your listeners are familiar with all this, but let's just take a second and say the foundation of the banking sector is making loans, right? Because you've got to be able to charge interest, and in a fractional reserve currency setup, then that's actually a form of money creation, right? When you originate a mortgage, then that's actually creating money and adding to the money stock. And so these charts are striking because the outstanding loans for these big banks have been stagnant since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And this is striking because the economy, the U.S. economy, measured by GDP, is up like 40%, and the population is up significantly. So, by demographics and the size of the economy, you'd reckon that total loans would be up at least 25 to 40%, and instead they're flatlined. So something is amiss, right? And so the Federal Reserve and other central banks are, creating a lot of money. And the money stock is soaring by literally like trillions in a matter of a few months, right? And so where's all this money going? Well, it's ending up as deposits in these banks, and we can argue about exactly why is that. But the bottom line is the banks can't find creditworthy borrowers to loan more money to, and creditworthy borrowers can't seem to find any reason to borrow money from the banks. And so this looks like the Fed and other central banks are pushing on a string.
Yeah, it's almost like the on the loan side of the equation, the economy has gone flatline since 2008, like it's just terminally ill.
Right. And we often mention financial repression. And for new listeners, this means like the Federal Reserve and other central banks repressing the market price of money, which is like the yields on bonds and the interest rates. um, offered by banks and lenders. And so the central banks have gone to extraordinary, unprecedented lengths to suppress yields and interest rates to basically near zero, especially if you look at the real rates. In other words, the yield minus inflation, you're actually, in a negative rate already. And this was the idea behind this policy, so we're told, was we're going to boost economic activity and growth, because at a really low interest rate, then more people are going to be able to borrow more money and invest it productively, and the economy is going to expand at a phenomenal rate. And instead, we look at these at the actual charts, and we realize the loans outstanding have gone nowhere. So clearly, the Fed has failed. This whole idea of financial repression was supposed to boost growth, and it isn't. It hasn't. And so, and this stagnation of loans reflects, I think, a stagnation in two critical areas. One is wage stagnation for the bottom 90%, right? So people have less disposable income. That means they're less creditworthy and more wary of taking on more debt. And also, there's fewer and fewer opportunities to invest productively in the United States. And so that may be another reason why there's no loan demand. I mean, and then before we started recording, you mentioned a whole other series of disincentives to borrowing and investing money, like over-regulation or the regulatory burden, compliance costs. And so why would somebody want to go borrow a lot of money and invest it in the U.S. economy with those headwinds?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The title of that article is "Stunning Divergence. Latest bank data reveals something is terminally broken in the financial system." And there's a whole slew of charts by different banks showing the total loans and deposits. And what's also very interesting is in the last year, the deposits have just gone through the roof, again, with the loan level still flatlined. But so the deposits have increased since 2008, but especially in the last year, since the beginning of the COVID crisis, it's just gone through the roof here. JP Morgan, one of the first charts here, the first chart in the article, shows a whopping 24% year over year increase. So that's just amazing. And we were talking just before we began the show about how there's such an environment of uncertainty. People are reluctant to invest. There's just indecisiveness. What's going to happen? Are things going to settle down? Is the crisis going to go on? Should I invest? So even people and entities with money are reluctant to invest in this environment, because of this environment of uncertainty. Your thoughts?
That's right, Richard. The pandemic sort of long tail of the pandemic is still playing out despite the vaccines. That there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether the vaccines will be effective against current variants and future variants, and how many booster shots are going to be required. And there's a lot of behavioral questions too, like, are people really going to pick back up their entire former lifestyle, or are they going to pare back some disposable income spending because of their own concerns? And I'm going to send you charts that you can post, Richard, that we were talking about the money stock, right, and the M2 money supply. And this is a Federal Reserve chart. And as to your point about the deposits soaring 5% or so, in February 2020, the M2 money stock was about 15 trillion. Well, in February 2021, roughly a year later, it's now 21 trillion. So there's been $6 trillion added to the money stock. And by all rights, if some percentage of that was going into the real economy, we'd see the velocity of M2 money increase. But instead, I have a Federal Reserve chart here of the velocity of M2 money, and it's completely collapsed to all-time lows. I mean, it was already low in the end of 2019, about 1.45, and now it's at 1.13. So obviously, none of this, very little of this money that's been created is actually reaching the real economy, whether by investment or funding more loans. It's a striking failure of financial repression. And so, Richard, where do the central banks go from here? They've already pushed yields and rates to near zero. They've created trillions of dollars of new money stock, and it's not helping the actual economy. So, I mean, have they run out of policy tricks?
I think now where it stands is there's the idea of yield curve control. So controlling what the interest rates are on the yield curve from short-term rates to long-term rates on the yield curve, and that is done through purchases of bonds at different points in the structure of that yield curve. But to do that, it's essentially a sacrificing of the currency to do so. So that's what falls away on this is the purchasing power of the currency. If this yield curve control policy goes into hyperdrive, so that there's been use of that to some extent already by different central banks, and also central banks appear to be calling upon governments on the fiscal side of the equation. So, central banks looking after monetary policy, but governments looking after fiscal policy. So central banks seem to be encouraging also the fiscal side to look at doing projects, infrastructure spending, to actually infuse money, directly into the economy in the form of fiscal stimulus, infrastructure-based fiscal stimulus. Your thoughts?
Right, and so I think what the general consensus view of that is that since private sector borrowing has stagnated and private sector spending and investment has stagnated, then it's up to the central government to go in, step in, and borrow and spend and invest to replace, the deficit, if you will, in private sector spending. And so that sounds all well and good, but we've seen what happens in Japan, where they're famously invested trillions of government borrowed funds in bridges to nowhere, supporting their construction industry. But the payoff in terms of increasing productivity or increasing the well-being of the population, the results have been really minimal, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's easy to talk about infrastructure, and there's certainly some very positive things that could be built out, but I don't think it's if it doesn't spark a renewal of confidence and investing in the private sector, then what happens is once the infrastructure project's done, then the economy goes back into stagnation, which is more or less what's happened in Japan, right? There's always this fiscal stimulus and infrastructure spending, and then they get a little boost. And then once those programs end, then they go back to private sector stagnation. Yeah. And another point that, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add to that, and even if you look at the fiscal stimulus over the last year, it hasn't really been on actual infrastructure spending, or not much of it. It's been more, paying the bills, keeping the cash flow going for everybody in terms of paying rents. There's some governments paying up to 90% of rents of downtown commercial real estate. That's what's happening. but largely not much on the fiscal stimulus, whether it's here in North America or even in Europe. Europe did announce European recovery funds, but actually talking today to some firms in Spain, how the delay just keeps going on the deployment of those European recovery funds for fiscal stimulus. They've been announced last year, and it's still ongoing. They still haven't distributed. There's all kinds of discussion. There's some reluctance by some of the countries, and so it's just total stagnation at this point.
Right, and another topic that it's been well covered, over the years, but it's worth mentioning here again because we're in such a speculative mania right now, is that the financial repression of lowering yields and to near zero is those people that have capital that wanted a low risk return. They've been stripped of those options, right? There are no returns that are low risk. So this financial repression has pushed everyone out on the so-called risk curve. In other words, you have to take on a significant amount of risk to get any return. And if you want a good return, you're going to be taking extraordinary risk. And so then part of the financial repression is the Federal Reserve places an implicit floor under the market, right? The so-called Fed put, whereby they're basically implicitly promising, if you go ahead and risk your capital in these risky speculative trades, we're going to protect you from losses. And so this is, of course, what they call moral hazard, right? Where you can take on risk, but the consequences will be diverted or shifted to someone else. You're not going to suffer the consequences of taking on risk, right? And so what we've seen now is a tremendous expansion of the retail trader, the small trader, putting money into extremely risky, actually crazy risky stuff, like borrowing money and then buying options on these high flyers like GameStop and Dogecoin and this kind of thing. And so far, they've been winning. And so then that winning has increased the speculative frenzy. But from an observer, that those of us who've been watching markets for decades, we have a strong sense that history tells us these kinds of speculative frenzies where people pile up more debt and make even riskier bets because they keep winning. Those manias usually end badly. And so, but my question is, what's been driving this retail investor mania? And I think, frankly, it's that for a large percentage of the American population, there's no way to get ahead in the sort of traditional sense of get a good job, save money, be able to buy a house. Those options are no longer possible unless you make a lot of money. And, that's about the top 5 or 10%. And so the bottom 90% doesn't really have a lot of options.
And that's your article.
So then therefore it's
today, right? That your article, the only way to get ahead now is crazy, risky speculation.
Right. And so we reading, media stories of young people, generating huge returns, like making $250,000 in GameStop options and things like that. And of course, everyone who reads that goes, "Wow, I want to do that too," right? And but I think the question I was exploring here is, wages have stagnated while housing, childcare, higher education, healthcare, all the big ticket expenses of having a family have soared like triple, quadruple, or even up tenfold, right, in the last, say, 30 years. And so meanwhile, wages are really stagnant in terms of purchasing power. So you've got flatlined wages and you've got expenses tripling or quadrupling. Well, where does that leave the wage earner? And so obviously there's this huge incentive to gamble because there's really no other way to get ahead. And that's a sad sort of statement on the culture and the economy that financial repression has created.
Mm-hmm. And actually, mentioning inflation, that's another policy tool that is likely to be employed at this time by central banks to reduce the burden of debt, right? So the idea that if you can have inflation at, let's say, 4% running for 10 years, if you do the math, that could be maybe around reducing the burden of the debt by one half. So if you have inflation rate at a higher rate than that, it may require, a shorter period of time. So that type of an approach, using the financial repression tool of inflation, and it's very likely coming. The Fed has talked about it, says it's looking at a bit more higher inflation than anticipated, and not to mention what's happening with supply chain disruptions, from the COVID crisis, shortages and everything, which may lead some governments to do price controls, which results in even more shortages, and so on and so forth. So that's very likely coming, which would reduce the purchasing power even further, right, of wages.
Right. And so on top of the sort of globalization element of wage earners, that virtually everybody in every country is competing against every other worker in every other part of the world, at least for tradable goods and services. So where does that leave society when people feel that they have their only way to get ahead is either basically buy a lottery ticket, or gamble in the stock market casino or in cryptocurrencies? And what's going to happen if those speculative bubbles do pop and people actually end up losing all that money that they made on the way up? That's going to create like social disappointment, if nothing else, and possibly social disorder, right? Because the Federal Reserve has basically said, well, look, at the way to get ahead is gamble in our casino. We'll make sure the market never falls for more than a couple of weeks, and we're always going to supply more liquidity. And so, but that promise is not actually what builds a good economy, right? In other words, the promise is we're going to give you a productive education, which you can apply through hard work and produce value and wealth. And and by saving some of that and investing it, then you and your family will be able to get ahead. And so that whole ladder of social mobility has been broken. And financial repression has a big role in it, because if the market could respond to the risks of and the price of money was set by the market, then interest rates would be higher, but assets would be cheaper too. And so the like, say, just to take housing, if you made 50% of the median income, 35 years ago, you could still buy a modest house somewhere. Well, now if you make 50% of the median income, you are completely out of it. Your income is like it's like 10 or 15 times the house is 10 or 15 times your annual wage. So that's where the inflation that the Fed is, as you spoke of, it's already far beyond their control in terms of assets, right? And one of the issues, just since we're talking about housing real quickly, what a lot of people don't understand is when the price of housing shoots up, it doesn't just price out home buyers, it prices out renters, because once the house goes from 250,000 to 750,000, then the new buyer has to jack up the rent to cover the higher property tax, the higher insurance. All of their costs go up. The house is the same. They didn't do any improvements. It didn't gain any utility or value. And so this kind of asset bubble that the Fed has generated, it raises costs throughout the economy.
Exactly, and it's been not only in the private sector. I mean, we're talking about the private sector and the capital markets, but in the public sector as well. So the idea of financial repression or repressing interest rates since the financial crisis of 2008 has actually allowed governments to borrow even more money than ever before, keeping the servicing of that debt level about the same. If interest rates go down, you can borrow more money, right, and still be about the same payment for servicing that debt. But at this point, with interest rates near zero or negative, like in Europe, and the level of debt about perhaps 3 times higher than it was in the 2008 crisis, they've essentially perhaps reached the limit of all of this borrowing, and that's where we are today. It's there's a big crisis in the indebted Western world. There's all kinds of talks about different solutions now. I hear the potential for changing rules in the either 401ks like in the U.S. or RSPs in Canada, changing rules so that you have to have, say, 50% of your assets in the state or provincial or federal government bonds, in an asset class that's declining in value, especially as interest rates go higher. You've got currency risk, interest rate risk, all together, and so there's some talk about that. There's also talk about conversion of the government bonds into interest-only bonds, so that the principal is never repaid, the so-called perpetual bonds. So you never get your principal back, but you just get a small amount of interest year over year forever. So that there's potential of converting the debt into that type of bond structure. There's even talk about IMF forgiveness programs. People are worried about that in terms of the idea that maybe the government either buys or converts your home if there's negative equity, or they provide funding to buy you out, or they convert the debt into equity as a part of some type of forgiveness program. There's all kinds of scenarios being discussed there. So it's just crazy what's happening in terms of financial repression tools.
Right, and so perhaps we can ask, what is the effect on the marginalized wage earner, and of all this, in other words, they keep pushing this string harder, but it's not really fixing what's wrong with the economy, right? Which is increasing productivity and creating more value and distributing, capital and agency, to the broader population, instead of concentrating all that wealth at the top, right? I mean, Wolf Richter had a chart out recently, which we about wealth inequality, that since the Fed boosts the value of assets, then the people who own the assets have benefited. That since in the last year, the top tier of the population has gained 20 trillion in net worth, and the bottom 50% of the U.S. population has gained 1.5 trillion. So there's just a tremendous asymmetry there. The top 5% get 20 trillion in net new wealth, and the bottom 50% made like literally 5 to 6% of that. So I think we're going to see a social repercussions of these
Yes.
extreme financial repression policies. And what I'm seeing is a positive element of this, which is a lot of young people are simply repudiating the entire financial system. In other words, they're building a micro house on a cheap rural plot of land. They're working in the gig economy, they have no interest in getting a $500,000 mortgage or trying to pile up a 401k because they know that's out of reach, and so they're not going to play the game anymore. And so that's an interesting possibility, and we've talked about it before, that people are simply going to migrate away from all of those the financial system entirely, other than earning money and buying stuff with cash or debit cards. They're not going to play in the casino. And so what happens to the central bank policies when people just opt out? And perhaps that's why the loan books of all these big banks have been stagnant for 12 years. Maybe people are opting out either because they can't afford to borrow more or they don't want to borrow more. They want out of the whole racket.
Yeah, exactly. And this goes to your many points in your many books. If you wanted to relate some of those ideas, like moving to solutions that make sense. So we always like to end our podcast on a positive note. Just wondering if you can relate like some of those aspects from your books, such as movement towards a more localized, decentralized economy, and finding your value proposition, personally. Just wondering on your thoughts.
Yeah, I think let's put it this way, and I don't know if I've beaten this into the ground or not, but let's say that wealth has like capital has a variety of manifestations, right? Like we know about financial wealth and financial capital, but there's also social capital, like what you know and and who you know and your networks of trusted people, and then you've got your intellectual capital, like your skill set and so on. And so I think the positive thing I'm seeing is people are deciding to build their non-financial capital, right? Like get a home, even if it's a micro home that you own free and clear. Yep. Start, embedding your job and your work in your local community. Even if you're making way less money, you're getting more value for that money, and your lifestyle costs are so much lower. So I think we're seeing maybe a shift to investing in non-financial forms of wealth. And actually that's a smart move, because non-financial forms of wealth, or bedrock kinds of wealth, such as land and farmland and forests and a home that you own free and clear, these things are not exposed to all the risk that's being dumped into the system by these by financial repression, right? Like if the currency fails and you don't have a bunch of financial wealth at risk, you've got a livelihood and a social network, well, then it's not really going to affect you that much, right? So maybe that's the future, is investing in non-financial wealth. And we've become obsessed with financial wealth, and that's exactly what's at risk of being devalued, by financial repression extremes.
Yeah, exactly. And even to that, the themes from the Austrian school of economics, in terms of emphasizing businesses with little or no debt, little or no leverage, positive high free cash flows would make sense, whether it's in the financial environment or non-financial world. Makes sense in this environment, in an era beset by excessive debt, excessive leverage. You get an advantage taking that approach.
Absolutely. And especially if you're providing essentials like energy, food, transport. I mean, there's just people have needs. And if you can do that on a local basis that's sustainable and no debt, then you're much more likely to have a solid investment of your time and capital.
Great. We'll end on that positive note. Excellent discussion, Charles. How can our listeners learn more about your work?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com, and I have sample chapters of all my books you can download and read for free.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charles.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. Great topic.
All right. We'll end it there. And yeah, that was great. Huh? That was good.
Well, these are old topics, but I think it's worth going back to them. Like,
Oh yeah,
it's just like the
that,
Fed's pushing on a string, and you know,
right.
and
Right.
I'm and I do see
Yeah.
more micro houses going up, or like
Oh yeah. I mean, even
it's two
here,
or three.
it's yeah. The only
Yeah,
thing is the zoning. So, because then
yeah,
the governments don't like that, right? These local municipalities, because you're sort of bypassing the system, right? But I think I
right.
told you that. I mean, that's how I got started too, right? Right after college. I mean, I just got this 7 acres up north in Northern California for it was 6.82 acres for $19,000. That's it. So I put down 3,000, and payments of 192 or something. I forgot, but per month. So, and it only cost me like $25 a month for all the utilities like electricity, gas, in a trailer, right? And then I said, well, I can bring in some revenue if I rent out a couple of. I'm authorized to do 2 mobile home spaces on this property, so I had 2 mobile homes come on on the property, and I started to collect rent, so like that. So, but yeah,
That was brilliant.
yeah,
Yeah, brilliant.
I know, and started planting guavas, feijoas, right, all kinds of stuff manually, and putting everything under that drip irrigation thing. So yeah, it was good experience, good time, and but yeah, it's that type of thing. The same thing with these micro. So it's either micro houses or tiny houses, they call them sometimes.
Yeah,
You just
right.
gotta find a space. I mean, we could actually put a few in our forest here. We're on like 5 acres, um, and you could be like I mean, we got a big ravine here, and you go down there, and it's pretty remote. I mean, even where we are, you don't really see the neighbors once the trees start growing leaves, like in a few weeks. We hardly can see the road, so it's pretty like the foliage, because there's so much forest here. It's pretty thick. But yeah, it's like lower cost. The whole thing is to, like you're saying, localized, decentralized, and we talk about the link into market environmentalism. Remember we had that podcast, so it all goes together, with that. And it's just, in an era beset by debt and leverage, excessive debt and leverage, right? It just makes sense to emphasize that direction, right? Because and then to increase your values, right? Like some of these books you have where how can you invest in yourself, and skill sets that are portable, that are high value, maybe unique, or demanded by the economy. Just self-improvement, right? I think you have emphasis in some of your books, right?
Yeah, exactly. Find a scarcity. But you probably ended up selling that acreage in Northern California, but I don't know, that would have been a great investment to hang on to it.
Yeah, I had to sell it for here to get this place, but yeah, I think it did go up like 4 or 5 times in price, so so I got some, and so
Yeah,
yeah, it was good, and although it did allow me to actually discover other areas, which is very interesting, because I mean, the place I had was in the Central Valley, up in the northern part of the Sacramento Valley, but then by riding around, taking rides, I found this area on the coast, which is like the land flowing with milk and honey, with where if you know where Willow Creek, California is, there's a town called.
yeah. I looked it up after you told me about it.
Yeah. It's about 30 miles inland from Eureka, and just inside. So where the fog will burn off fairly quickly, and it's warm enough to grow olives and figs, but you still have plenty of water because the Klamath River, right, gorge, right, goes right through there from Wairika to Eureka, and there's all these wild blackberries growing everywhere, like the ones that you pay $4 or $5 a quart for, right, at least here, and you can just stop anytime and pick up those fruit, right, on the side of the road for free, right? They're just growing wild next to the river, and which is next to the road. So so that was I mean, that area is like so you could literally go there and get, again, I don't know what it is now, but I would say, let's say 5 acres for maybe $100K or something. This is well north of the Bay Area, right? Because the Bay Area is unreachable, right? The pricing, but once you get more than about 2 or 3 hours north, then the prices drop precipitously.
Right.
But the climate
no commuting.
Yeah, the climate is like Lebanon, right? It's this is just south of Oregon, but north of Ukiah, right? That's that area there is still, I mean, unknown, undiscovered, but it's probably the best, other than Hawaii, like in terms of climate, scenery, vegetation. I mean, it's different from Hawaii, right? It's more of a Mediterranean, type of climate at the beginning of the Mediterranean. So it is like a Lebanon, right? So no desert, but land flowing with milk and honey, plenty of water, warm enough. As long as it's warm enough to grow olives and oranges, right? That's pretty mild. And
oh yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Hey, real quick, how is your Austrian School ESG podcast series going?
Oh, okay. So
the one.
Yeah, we actually have 2 podcasts going now. So one is sort of this one, which is still, Austrian School, FRA. We don't have one dedicated for only Austrian School, but we have another one that we started called The Green Market. And
The Green Market. Yeah, so I was on the first one. Yeah.
Remember that? Yeah, and so so that one's going well, and we're doing more of them, like pretty much once a week, with the British Conservation Alliance and the Austrian Economic Center, all 3 of us partnering. So the emphasis is on market environmentalism, right? So we're essentially the alternative Great Reset, right? That we're providing the the non authoritarian way to environmentalism, so to speak, because the Great Reset does have some good points, like the World Economic Forum Great Reset, right, that everybody's talking about. I mean, some of it is good, like the use of technology, the use of innovation, but then, the people aspects, that's where it gets out of hand, right? Because, people are not going to be happy with constant surveillance and monitoring and trying to have behavioral change or forcing behavior in certain directions against their interest or against their will. And I think this is what a lot of this is about, right? Is they're trying to use the COVID thing to get the vaccination proof, or at least a test, right? If you don't want the vaccine, but at least a test. Trying to get that initially on an app, on a government app that goes on your cell phone, which everybody has these days. I think that's what the goal is. And then from that point, cashless society, of course, and all that. But it's much more than that, right? I think it's going to be very totalitarian, authoritarian. I mean, a lot of it will be steered toward the environment, but it'll be also used to see what you're up to. Like, is this guy thinking about moving out of the country? We're going to have brain drain, wealth drain, right? That's the nightmare that governments fear, which could happen here and all these places, and it's already happening. Believe me, people are leaving. The wealthy are leaving. The educated are leaving. and it's just going to get poorer and poorer. I think Canada might be finished. I'm not kidding. And so it's, but anyways, yeah, kind of just getting off track. But yeah, that's the idea. So, but pushing and using technology and innovation, I think, is the way to go, because there's one fact we're going to explore. I'm going to do one next week, I think. Yeah. I'm going to do one podcast next week that talks about with the Organic Consumers Association, that guy Ronnie Cummins, and also Andre Lee of Regeneration International. Those two guys, they have a fact on their website that states if you just increase the sustainability of farmlands, rangelands, and forest lands around the world, by only 5 to 10%, that you just make it more sustainable by up to 5 to 10%. If you do that, basically the carbon sequestration essentially cancels all the carbon emissions that everybody's worried about, through human emissions and industry and all this. So that's what is, if you take that approach, that's all you need to do, is focus on that, and the problem is solved. And to do that, you can apply a lot of technology and innovation. There's different things you can do. ABB is a great company that does a lot in this regard. And so they provide technology solutions, innovation solutions. So you basically use that, and that's what should be applied, right? And then you let people still be free, have freedoms and liberties at the same time. And, I think that's the answer. So this whole centralized approach to environmentalism, agenda-based, right, Great Reset and World Economic Forum, Great Reset, it's going to end in failure, right? Just like any centralized planning exercise attempt does, right? Like Soviet Union, the environment's going to get really bad. It's going to get inefficient. The Soviet Union is 3 times more inefficient on energy use than the Western world. Look what they did to the environment, all these lakes drying up, radiation all over the place. And, so it's total disaster. So that's how this is going to end up. It's going to be a disaster. The whole centralized planning approach, and they're going beyond the environment now. It's just that, like, the whole economy is being centrally managed. It's just crazy here in Canada.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much. Ciao. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you, Richard.
Have a good one. Yeah.
Talk to you later.
The FRA Roundtable Insight Show is for informational and educational purposes only, and should not be considered as a solicitation or offer to purchase or sell any securities. The investments, investment strategies, and investment philosophies discussed or presented on the show each involve their own unique risk factors, which are not discussed on the show. Any discussions among the panel participants or responses to listener inquiries are based on the personal opinions of the panel participants and do not take into consideration the listener's suitability, objectives, or risk tolerance. Please be advised that you invest or speculate at your own risk.